of injustice is involved in these privileges? What two elements are involved in the right of contract? Under what conditions is this the right to sell? What dangers attend freedom in the establishment of private enterprises? What natural limitations are there to the right of personal liberty? Literature, annual reports of the United States Commissioners of Patents, especially the reports of 1888. State participation in industry. We have seen that the state's first service to economic activity is the maintenance of certain fundamental conditions which are necessarily conditions of that activity. We now have to consider another set of conditions furnished by the states, conditions less fundamental and more nearly allied to the private factors of production, but of such a nature that only state can furnish them efficiently. Industrial facilities. Under this head may be placed roads, rivers, and harbor improvements, lighthouses, and other public works whose purpose is primary to facilitate industry. These are closely allied to capital invested in private plants, but they are works of such great general utility and difficult of calculation that only the state can or will undertake them. To a limited extent, roads may be built by private individuals and the cost defrayed by charging toll, but this never produces a satisfactory and adequate road system. To a still more limited extent, private contributions may aid the construction of workers of general utility, but the experience of all nations has shown by undertakings which require great outlay and the promise only of vague and remote returns difficult of collection will not usually attract private enterprise, and the service was rendered by private enterprise is not satisfactory if we view the results from a broad social standpoint. The only questions, therefore, are as to which department of government should be entrusted with this economic function and how much should be done. On both these questions, there has been much debate and much unsatisfactory experimentation in these cases of roads, and policy has prevailed of leaving their construction and maintenance to the city, village, or township. This policy, combined in the rural districts with an antiquated and vicious system of taxation, has resulted in the system of roads which are national disgrace. This extreme legalization of responsibility has fostered narrow views and niggardliness. Rural industry. Yeah, it says niggardliness. Niggardliness, which has brought as a result impeded and impoverished rural industry. This mistaken policy is largely due to a reaction against unwise outlays made at an early date in many states at a time when resources were meager, and the result was burdensome debts which some of the states repudiated, and in some states clauses were inserted in the Constitution prohibiting expenditure by the state for roads and similar improvements. This explains the policy but does not justify it, and in its encouraging note to an agitation in the favor of road improvements has begun which promises substantial results. The mistake seems to have been in defining local interest. Because a mile of road in a township, it does not follow that it is in a township interest. It may and often does form a part of a far-reaching and important system and represents interest, which the town will quite fail to appreciate. A post office is a local in situation, but suppose townships were left to operate their own post offices. Would they do it adequately? And if not, would none but local interests suffer? In sharp contrast to our road system stand our river and harbor improvements, in connection with which the policy of national maintenance has prevailed. Whatever may be said of jobbery and mismanagement in connection with these improvements, their record has been economy and efficiency itself, compared with the wasteful and shiftlessness management of our roads. Bounties, subsidies, and franchises. Under this head are included a great number of tangible encouragements, not to private enterprises in general, but to particular enterprises. They differ from industrial facilities, which we have just discussed, in that they are not public works open to private use, but transfers of goods to particular individuals or private corporations to encourage their undertaking. Bounties are sums of money offered as inducements to private parties. During the late war, they were offered to induce men to enlist into the army. As their use in such cases is exceptional, and due to emergencies which do not ordinarily arise and do not directly concern industry, we may omit from this part from our discussion. Bounties are, however, paid by many governments for producing certain goods, which are various reasons it is deemed wise to encourage. The example familiar to us in that of the sugar bounty of 2 cents per pound on sugar raised within the United States. Canada offers bounties on iron, ore mined, etc. Subsidies are closely allied in principle to bounties. They are payments to those undertaking enterprise of importance to the public, but too extensive to be directly remunerative. Fuck. Love that word. Remunerative. Fuck yes. They are usually in the form of annual payments of a fixed sum. Money subsidies are common. Such are the subsidies to steamship companies, which have been voted at the time or another by nearly all powerful nations. Subsidies have been granted to many other objects in some of the countries of Europe. Theaters and operas received annual subsidies. Land grants. Subsidies are not always in money. A frequent form of subsidy to railways and canals in this country is known as the land grant. Railways built through unsettled territory have often received grants from the government of alternative sections of the government land for a fucking distance. Steamship subsidies have several times been granted by our federal government. A subsidy of $350,000 per annum was granted to a line running to Germany in 1847, and others soon after. And in 1852, our government paid $1,946,686 in subsidies to encourage the development of American merchant marine. The system was discontinued in 1885, but resumed in 1865. It developed extensive scandals and was abolished again in 1875. The policy has seemingly resumed by the last Congress in the mail contract granted to the American line, quote, of steamships by the conditions of which Paris and New York were registered as American vessels. Of some miles on each side of the railway. These grants, which might perhaps better be classed as bounties than as subsidies, have been the subject of much dispute and the occasion of great abuses. Railways which have failed to comply with the conditions of their grants have not unfrequently managed to keep possessions of them in defiance of obvious justice. Loans of public credit are another kind of subsidy. They are in principle a guarantee of private indebtedness by government. The most prominent example of this in our history is the so-called Credit Mobilier Company, organized from the building of the Union Pacific Railway. The federal government, in addition to an imperial land grant aggregating over 30 million acres of the Union and Central Pacific Railways, guaranteed the indebtedness of the company for $25,000 per mile of the road in addition. The remarkable subsidy, almost sufficient to build the road, was secured by extensive bribery in which many members of Congress were implicated. This has been pronounced by a recent writer to be probably the most extensive legislative scandal ever known in the United States. The uselessness of this assistance is seen in the fact that the money was virtually absorbed by the construction companies, which had corrupted Congress to secure it, and added practically nothing to the value of the road. Franchises may for our purposes be extinguished into two classes, namely franchises in a broader and franchises in a narrower sense. Franchises in the broader sense are special rights and privileges conferred by a legislative body which could not be exercised otherwise. The power granted to a number of men to act as a corporation is itself a franchise, and the various attributes of the corporation are its franchises. Franchises, in a narrower sense, are grants of the use of public property for private enterprises, such as the right granted a street railway or gas company to lay its tracks or its mains in the streets. A franchise may be granted for a term of years or forever. It may be granted free or sold for a specified amount or for a percentage of receipts. It may be granted unconditionally or conditionally, but however it may be granted, it maintains one character at the bottom. It is a bargain between private parties and public officials for valuable public property. In general, the interests are great, the officials few, and the private property is wealthy. If corruption is possible, these are the conditions to produce it. It will not surprise us, therefore, to find that after the credit mobiler, perhaps to the next greatest scandal in the United States of recent years is connected with the granting of franchises. In 1884, 13 out of 24 aldermen in New York formed an organization for the purpose of selling franchises and agreed to vote together on all business transactions. Quote, they held frequent meetings at which they debated offers from private corporations. The Broadway Surface Company offered them $500,000 for a streetcar franchise, which was granted free. Being voted by the mayor, it became necessarily to enlarge their organization, and before it was finally passed over the mayor's veto, 22 aldermen were implicated. The fraud was fortunately discovered and some of its perpetrators punished, but none of the immense value of the property thus lost to the city was recovered. It is useless to reproach those men, culpable as they certainly are. They are in no small degree the victims of a system which corrupts private parties as surely as effectually as it does the state, and for which society as a whole is responsible. It is surely desirable that good men but chosen to office, but as surely as carry on attracts vultures rather than doves, so surely will a system which holds out special possibilities of rascality attract men who will profit by these opportunities. It is doubtful if a government ever existed in a developed country which could safely trust itself with the management of a vast private interest which our civilization has developed. Certain it is, no society ever before asked for it of its officials such impossible virtues, or obtained them if it did. We have said already in speaking of the functions of the state that it is adapted to enterprise of a special nature, that it is enterprise which profit a part of the citizens rather than the whole. We might expect then that the history of the state aid to the special industries would not be wholly flattering, and we shall not be disappointed in this expectation. Much is said about corruption in public undertakings. There is relatively little such corruption, as we shall see later. Corruption occurs in mixed undertakings in which part of the transactions are secret and irresponsible, and bribery is made both lucrative and safe, while an occasional public enterprise like the building of the Capitol at Albany has been characterized by extravagance and inefficiency and perhaps gross frauds. Such cases are the exception. On the other hand, the history of government aid to private corporations has scarcely a clean page. The reason is not so far to seek a public transaction is wholly public. Every step in it is open, not only to the inception of officials, but often to that of the private individuals as well. Even when officials are lenient and the public negligent, the opportunities of embezzlement are comparatively few. There is always a chance and generally a likelihood of detection. A private corporation, on the other hand, is private. It can conceal profits, falsify accounts, water stock, and in 1,000 ways conceal the nature of its transactions. If it spends money to buy up legislators, the public frequently does not find it out. The power is bad enough when there is no question of government aid. But when private interests are enlisted to secure subsidies, land grants, franchises, etc., the power is a menace to the very existence of liberty. Another difference between public and mixed enterprises is that the former are much more readily changed. When the state decides upon a public undertaking, it does so by statute, which can amend or repealed as needed requires. But corporations are organized under charter, and however injurious to society, these characters having been declared contracts by our courts are made inviolable, and by our federal constitution, mistakes thus made by government in these mixed undertakings cannot be remedied. As in the case of strictly public enterprises, this branch of our history is full of instances of exaggerated privileges conferred on by private corporations for long terms or in perpetuity, and which simply had to be endured. It is hardly too much to say that the principle of state aid to special enterprises is the most vicious and uncontrollable of all forms of state activity. While it may be and doubtless is justifiable in certain cases, all experience points to a reduction rather than the increase of the number of mixed enterprises. It is no implication that legislators are worse than other men to say that their integrity should not be exposed to extreme test, which it has so often and so significantly failed to bear, wherein the annals of contemporary public enterprise could be find a parallel to the Credit Mobilier in America or the Panama Canal scandal in France. The corruption of government is a sad fact, but it is largely a corruption by private interest. This leads us to the second objection. There is no necessity for it. Private enterprises, which because of their magnitude or because they are undertaken for a general interest, cannot succeed without public aid, are unfit for private management. State participation in industry is the simplest form, consists in the further furnishing of free industrial facilities, roads, harbors, etc. The public roads in the United States have been generally left to units more local than the interest involved, and have been neglected in the consequence. River and harbor improvements have been committed in the central government with better, though not ideal, results. Bounties and subsidies are payments of money to encourage private enterprises. Land grants are forms of subsidy to railways and canals. Loans of public credit are public guarantees of private indebtedness. Franchises and grants of privilege are more narrowly grants of public property for temporary or permanent use by private parties. All these forms of public aid to individual enterprises have been more or less productive of corruption wherever adopted. Mixed enterprises are less responsible to public than public enterprises. Mismanagement of mixed enterprises is more difficult of correction than of public enterprise. Being protected by charter rights, private enterprises requiring extensive public control are safer in the hands of the state. Why should the state build roads? If left the private enterprise, what would be the result? What is the advantage of the country or county or state over the township in road building, and vice versa? What policy has prevailed in the United States in road building and harbor improvement? What are the present tendencies? What is a bounty, a subsidy, a land grant, a loan of public credit, a franchise? What is the danger of each, and why? What are the objections to state participation in individual private enterprises? What other policy is possible? The railways and the republic. That's the literature. State regulation of industry by taxation. We have to do, not with taxation as a means of raising revenue, the consideration of which comes later, but with the taxation as a measure of repression or encouragement. Such taxation is of two kinds: taxation on domestic products and taxation on imports. Tax on domestic products. When duties are laid on great variety of manufactured domestic products, most of them are purely revenue duties. Such was the case during our last war with our, quote, internal revenue, and often in the history of many European countries. Such duties are also frequently called excise duties. No government lays duties in general for the purpose of restricting or repressing the development of its own industries. To this rule, however, England and America have made a few undoubted exceptions. To the tobacco and liquor industries need limitation of most stringent character. As many people believe, and this sentiment expresses itself in these countries by restrictive taxation, in England this restrictive charter of the tax is less marked, and the need of revenue would probably keep the tax force even if the theory of restriction were not held. But in the United States, this purpose of the tax is so strongly marked that at a time when our revenues were excessive and a means of reducing them was earnestly sought through sentiment in favor of those taxes was strong enough to prevent their repeal. The history of our internal repressive taxation has at least two lessons. In the first place, the tax must not be too high. Beyond a certain point, it fails to repress and results in invasion and corruption of officials. During the period when whiskey was overtaxed in our country, it was constantly sold in our markets at less than the amount of the tax. What clear proof could there be than that of the law was evaded? Another tendency was developed at the same time, perhaps even more pernicious, namely the adulteration of liquors with poisonous ingredients. The fearful character of the intoxicating liquor sold here and since that time is in large part due to habits fostered by injudicious efforts as repressive taxation. The second lesson is that repressive taxation on industries of the character exercises but a feeble influence on the direction of repression. Probably the most efficient service such as a tax renders its shift. Consumption from a heavily taxed and supposedly more injurious liquor to more lightly taxed and presumably more innocent one. This result has sometimes followed in a marked degree, but beyond this principle, argument for such taxes must be the revenue they produce. Protective duties. These are duties levied on imports with a view to increase the price of goods brought from abroad, and so protect, quote, the home producer against foreign competitors, and thus regulate commerce in his favor. This regulation is called protectionism, and it will at once be recognized as a vast subject which could easily be made to fill several volumes like the present. It will here be possible merely to mention the main points in the controversy between those who believe in this kind of regulation, protectionists, and those who do not, free traders. Arguments of protectionists. It is argued in favor of protectionism that it promotes nationalism, and this is held to be a good thing. It is urged that domestic trade draws the citizens of a country together, while international trade is a cosmopolitan and tends to their separation. Protectionists maintain further that protective tariffs are necessarily in order to build up a diverse national industrial life. They claim that there exist in a new country like the United States many natural industrial advantages of which the inhabitants cannot avail themselves unless they are least temporarily protected. Government, should they say, foster infinite industries in order to develop our natural resources and to produce diversity in industrial pursuits. The diversified national industry argument of the protection to infant industries argument are thus supplementary. It is held that older nations with their superior capital and acquired skill will break down new pursuits in the infancy in order thereafter to have the market themselves. Closely connected with this argument, based on military grounds, it is often thought by protectionists that industrial national independence prepares a nation better for international war. The home market argument protection naturally follows.